The NFL loves to talk about progress. Every coaching cycle, we hear the same lines: more interviews, more opportunities, more diversity. But what no one wants to admit is that the outcomes keep telling the same story. Interviews happen, press releases get written, and then the doors close, usually on the same people. This year's coaching cycle didn't just expose flaws in the Rooney Rule, it exposed something deeper: who the league instinctively trusts to lead and who it constantly second guesses. Because when black coaches need perfect resumes, spotless records, and years of proof, while others get curiosity, grace, and benefit of the doubt, that's no coincidence, that's a double standard. Today, we're breaking down how the Rooney Rule became cover, not correction, and why this cycle made that impossible to ignore. If you believe football history deserves honesty, not spin, you're in the right place. The Rooney Rule didn't come out of nowhere. It was born out of embarrassment and pressure. In the early 2000s, the NFL was forced to confront an ugly truth it had spent decades avoiding. Black head coaches were winning more games, yet getting fired faster and hired less often than their white counterparts. The tipping point came in 2002. Tony Dungy was fired by Tampa Bay despite building a winning culture and turning the Buccaneers into a perennial playoff team. Around the same time, Dennis Green was let go in Minnesota after just one losing season, his first in nearly a decade. These weren't rebuilding failures, these were successful black coaches being treated as disposable. Civil rights attorneys ran the numbers, and the data made the league look indefensible. Black head coaches had higher winning percentages, yet shorter leashes. They were expected to fix broken franchises instantly, while others were granted patience, excuses, and second chances. The message was clear: performance alone was never enough. That's when the league acted, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Public pressure mounted, former players and executives organized, and the NFL introduced the Rooney Rule as a way to prove it was doing something. But from the very beginning, the rule was limited by design. It didn't require teams to hire minority candidates. It didn't require teams to seriously consider them. It required only one thing: an interview. And that distinction matters. Because an interview can be genuine or it can be ceremonial. It can be the start of opportunity or the end of a process that was already decided. The Rooney Rule was sold as progress, but in reality, it was a compromise. One that allowed the league to claim fairness without forcing owners to confront their own biases. And that flaw, baked in from day one, is exactly why the same argument still exists today. Here's the part the league never explains honestly. The Rooney Rule doesn't measure intent, it measures attendance. Show up, conduct the interview, file the paperwork, and you're officially compliant. What happens next is completely up to the people who already hold the power. Over time, teams learned how to game the system without ever breaking it. Interviews started happening late in the process, after insiders had already leaked who the real hire was going to be. Some candidates were flown in after finalists were chosen. Others were interviewed knowing the job was already promised to someone else. On paper, everything looked clean. In reality, the outcome was locked before the first question was asked. This is how the Rooney Rule quietly mutated from a safeguard into a shield. Because now, when criticism comes, teams don't have to defend who they hired. They just point to who they interviewed. And that subtle shift changed everything. The burden stopped being on owners to explain their decisions and instead fell on black coaches to explain why yet another interview didn't turn into a job. The language around those interviews started to sound familiar too: strong leader, impressive presence, just missed. Always close, never chosen. Meanwhile, white candidates were allowed to be raw, intriguing, or ahead of schedule. Potential became a virtue. Incompleteness became upside. That's the loophole. When interviews are mandatory but outcomes aren't questioned, bias never has to announce itself. It just quietly repeats. And the most damaging part: the league can still claim success. Because technically, the rule worked. Interviews happened, photos were taken, statements were released. But if the same group keeps being passed over year after year, the problem isn't the candidates. It's the system that learned how to look fair without ever being fair at all. This is where the conversation gets uncomfortable. Because the Rooney Rule didn't create the double standard, it just made it easier to hide. Black coaches are evaluated as if the margin for error is zero. Not small, zero. They don't get to be interesting. They don't get to be ahead of schedule. They don't get to be learning on the job. Every interview comes with an unspoken demand. Prove you won't fail. They're asked about leadership style, temperament, locker room control, media presence, things that somehow never seem to come up with the same intensity for others. A single bad season becomes a referendum on competence. A single personality clash becomes a character flaw. A single loss becomes proof they were never ready. Meanwhile, the league routinely frames white candidates as projects. If they haven't coached long enough, they're fresh. If they failed before, they're experienced. If they haven't proven anything yet, they're high IQ football minds. The exact same resume gap that disqualifies a black coach becomes an advantage for someone else. This is why so many black coordinators get stuck in limbo. Too successful to ignore, but never quite trusted enough to lead. They're told to wait their turn in a league where turns are handed out selectively. They're told to build more relationships in an industry built almost entirely on relationships they were never fully invited into. And when the jobs don't come, the narrative quietly shifts the blame. Maybe he didn't interview well. Maybe ownership wanted a different direction. Maybe it just wasn't the right fit. But after 20 plus years of the Rooney Rule, coincidence is no longer a credible explanation. If black coaches were simply underqualified, the numbers would correct themselves. If the process were truly open, results would fluctuate. Instead, what we see is consistency. The same skepticism, the same delays, the same exits. And once you recognize that pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore what comes next. And then came the moment that ripped the mask off the entire process. During this coaching cycle, Philip Rivers, a former quarterback with no college coaching experience and no NFL coaching experience, was granted a head coaching interview. His resume, from a coaching standpoint, consisted of high school football. Let that sit for a second. No coordinator background, no position coach grind, no years buried in film rooms or staff meetings, just pedigree, familiarity, and the unspoken assumption that of course he could lead men. And to be clear, this isn't about Rivers personally. This is about what his interview represented. Because at the same time, black coaches with decades in the league, men who have built top 5 units, mentored Pro Bowlers, and survived multiple regimes are told they need more time, more seasoning, more proof, more boxes checked. Philip Rivers didn't need proof, he got curiosity. That's the double standard in its purest form. When a white former quarterback walks into a room, the league sees leadership by default, intelligence by default, authority by default. The resume becomes optional because the archetype feels familiar. But when a black coach walks into that same room, the league doesn't see upside, it sees risk. The questions aren't about vision or philosophy, they're about control, temperament, whether the locker room will respond, whether he's ready for this level. And that's why the Rivers interview mattered more than any press release about diversity. Because it's confirmed what so many coaches already knew. The bar is not the same. One group is allowed to grow into the job, the other must arrive fully formed, flawless, or not arrive at all. If the Rooney Rule was designed to create opportunity, moments like this prove how easily opportunity still follows comfort instead of competence. What makes this coaching style different isn't that the Rooney Rule was violated, it's that it was followed perfectly. And the outcome still looked exactly the same. Teams checked every box, minority candidates were interviewed, statements were released about thorough searches, and impressive conversations. From a legal standpoint, the NFL could say everything worked as intended, and that's the problem. Because when the rule is followed and the results still funnel toward the same profile of hire, the issue is no longer enforcement, it's design. The Rooney Rule doesn't stop teams from deciding in advance. It doesn't stop owners from favoring familiarity. It doesn't stop back-channel deals, informal promises, or the quiet understanding of who the job is really for. This cycle made that painfully clear. Experienced black candidates were brought in late, some interviews felt rushed, others felt symbolic. And when the hires were announced, the explanations sounded eerily familiar. Culture fit, vision alignment, long term plan, vague language that can't be challenged, audited, or disproven. Meanwhile, the league keeps pushing the same talking point that the pipeline is improving, that more minority assistants will eventually lead to more minority head coaches. But the pipeline argument falls apart when people already in the pipeline are still being bypassed. That's why the Brian Flores allegations hit so hard. When he described interviews as shams, it wasn't shocking, it was recognizable. Too many coaches had lived that exact experience. Sit down, answer the question, smile for the photo, go home knowing the decision was already made. This cycle didn't fail because of a lack of rules, it failed because the rules protect processes over truth. And as long as the league can say we complied, it never has to explain why the same people keep getting passed over. Here's the harsh truth the league never says out loud. The Rooney Rule works exactly the way the NFL needs it to work. It protects owners. As long as the rule is framed around interviews instead of outcomes, the league gets insulation, legal insulation, public relations insulation, moral insulation. When criticism comes, the response is automatic. We followed the process. And once the conversation shifts to process, the results are no longer up for debate. That's why the rule keeps expanding sideways instead of upward. More interview requirements, more pipeline initiatives, more incentives for developing candidates, anything except accountability at the point of power. Because the moment you start questioning outcomes, you start questioning decision makers. And that's the line the league refuses to cross. The Rooney Rule allows owners to feel progressive without surrendering control. It lets them claim openness while still hiring from the same circles they've always trusted. It turns discrimination into something unprovable because bias doesn't have to be explicit, it just has to be consistent. And consistency is exactly what we've seen. If the league truly believed the problem was solved, there wouldn't still be lawsuits. There wouldn't still be historic hires every few years. There wouldn't still be cycles where qualified black coaches are praised publicly and passed over privately. But the NFL doesn't need the Rooney Rule to work, it just needs to exist. Because a rule with no consequences isn't reform, it's branding. At this point, the question isn't whether the Rooney Rule exists, it's whether it actually changes anything. When one group needs perfection and another gets patience, that's not progress, that's a pattern. If you care about football history being told honestly, not conveniently, make sure you're subscribed to Old School Sundays. This is the place where erased stories get brought back into the light and the uncomfortable truths don't get edited out. Thank you for rocking with us, and if this conversation made you uncomfortable, good. That's how real change starts.